The crystal moon of Velthera hung like a giant diamond against the black space around it, and Captain Daeho Kim stared at it through the small window of his transport ship while thinking about how far from home he was and how much trouble waited. For him down there on that shining surface where the most important fighting tournament in the galaxy was about to begin and where humans were not wanted at all. The ship moved closer to the moon, and Daeho could see the huge arena built into the crystal surface like someone had carved a perfect circle into the heart of a jewel, and around it were smaller buildings where all the different alien species would stay during the tournament, and he knew that most of those aliens thought humans were nothing more than stupid animals who had just learned to fly between stars only 5 years ago. Hai-Jin Park sat beside him looking at her communication device and reading messages from Earth while her face showed worry because she knew this mission was dangerous, and that humans had never been to anything like this before, and that they were only allowed to come because the Galactic Council had to follow their own rules about new member species, even when they did not want to, behind them. Wu Jin Lee was studying files about all the alien warriors who would fight in the tournament, and his tactical computer was making soft beeping sounds as it tried to calculate fighting patterns and weaknesses. But the data was incomplete, because most species kept their best fighting secrets hidden from everyone else, especially from humans who they saw as newcomers with no right to know such things. The transport ship landed on a platform made of the same crystal material as the moon itself, and when they stepped outside, Daeho felt the artificial gravity pull at him in a way that was different from Earth gravity, but not uncomfortable, and the air was clean and tasted of nothing, which meant the life support systems were working perfectly to keep all the different species alive in the same environment. A tall alien made of what looked like living crystal walked toward them, and its body reflected light in patterns that hurt to look at directly and when it spoke. Its voice sounded like breaking glass mixed with distant thunder, and Daeho knew this must be High Marshal Veltharian, who organized the tournament and who had the power to decide if humans would be allowed to participate or sent home in shame high. Marshal Veltharian looked down at the three humans, and his crystal face showed no expression that they could understand, but his voice carried clear dislike when he said that humans were late, and that their assigned time for registration was almost over, and that perhaps they should return to their primitive planet and try again in a few hundred years when they might be ready for real combat. Ho kept his face calm and polite, even though he wanted to tell this crystal alien exactly what he thought about being called primitive, and instead he said that they were ready to register their champion for the tournament according to the rules that had been agreed upon when humanity joined the Galactic Council, and that they would not be leaving without fighting. The crystal alien made a sound like wind blowing through broken glass and led them into the registration building where dozens of other aliens were gathered around tables and screens, showing information about their champions and their species' military achievements. And when the humans entered the room, all conversation stopped, and every alien eye turned to stare at them, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open contempt. Veltharian began explaining the rules of the tournament in a voice that suggested he was wasting his time talking to creatures too stupid to understand, and he said that each species would send one champion to fight in single combat, and that victories would determine resource allocation rights for entire star systems, and that the tournament had been held every 10 years for 3,000 years without interruption. He pointed to a huge display showing star maps with different colored sections, and explained that the winning species would gain control of the richest mining systems while the losers would have to accept whatever scraps were left over, and that humans being new members would be granted one small mining system in the outer rim if they managed to win even a single fight, which he clearly thought was impossible. The other alien representatives were introduced one by one, and each one looked more dangerous than the last, and first were the Korthak, who stood 3 meters tall with natural armor plating and muscles that could crush steel, and who had dominated ground combat throughout the galaxy for over 1,000 years, and whose champion Graktor had never lost a single fight. Then came the Nexari, who were smaller than humans, but covered in technological devices that enhanced their speed and strength and gave them energy shields that could stop most weapons, and their champion Telvash wore armor that seemed to be made of pure energy and carried weapons that could cut through starship hulls. The Mordan representative was the strangest of all, because it looked almost human, except for its completely black eyes and the way it seemed to float slightly above the ground without any visible technology, and Veltharion explained that their champion Scythane could move objects with thought alone and had once stopped an asteroid from hitting a planet just by concentrating. There were others too, and each species had champions with abilities that seemed impossible to defeat and genetic enhancements that made them faster and stronger than any human could ever be, and technological weapons that were centuries ahead of anything Earth had ever developed. And as Daiho listened, he began to understand just how outmatched humanity really was. The final champion introduced was Morgeth Drakul, who was called the Ascended, and who had won the tournament for the last 300 years without losing a single match, and who was described as the perfect fusion of the best traits from multiple species enhanced with the most advanced technology and psychic abilities known to exist. When it was time to register the human champion, Daiho stepped forward and announced that Major Sungmin Choi would represent. Earth and Veltharion entered the name into the tournament system, while making it clear that he expected the human to be eliminated in the first round, and that this would prove humans were not ready for galactic politics. But then everything went wrong, because a message came through on Hyojin's communication device, and her face went white as she read it, and she grabbed Daiho's arm and whispered that Major Choi had been rushed to the medical facility on their ship with some kind of alien infection that the doctors could not identify, and that he was unconscious and might not survive. The other aliens in the room began making sounds that might have been laughter, or might have been the alien equivalent of mocking, and Veltharion said that without a champion, humans would have to forfeit and accept the minimum resource allocation, which was basically nothing, and return to Earth with proof that they did not belong among the real powers of the galaxy. Daiho felt anger rising in his chest because he knew this was exactly what the aliens had wanted to happen, and that they had probably arranged for Choi to get sick somehow, and that they thought humans would just give up and go home quietly, but they did not understand humans very well if they thought that would happen. Without thinking about it too much, because thinking would have made him realize how insane it was, Daiho announced that he would take Major Choi's place as the human champion, and the entire room fell, silent except for the sound of alien breathing and the humming of electronic equipment. Veltharion's crystal face somehow managed to show surprise, and he said that Daiho was just a ship captain with no special training or enhanced abilities, and that he would be killed in the first fight, and that perhaps humans should reconsider this foolish decision. Hyojin grabbed his arm again and said this was crazy, because he had no chance against any of these champions, and that she could not let him throw his life away for nothing. But Daiho looked at her, and then at Wu Jin, and then at all the alien faces staring at him with expressions of disbelief and amusement. He thought about his daughter, so young back on Earth, and about all the humans who were counting on this mission to succeed, and about how sometimes someone had to step up even when the odds were impossible. And he told Veltharion to register him as the human champion because Earth would not be backing down. The crystal alien made the registration with what seemed like satisfaction, because he clearly expected to watch a human die quickly and painfully, and the other alien representatives began discussing among themselves in voices that carried certainty that the human problem would be solved very soon. As they left the registration building, Hyojin was angry and worried and kept asking what he thought he was doing, and Wu Jin was already calculating the impossible odds and suggesting they find a way to get him some kind of advantage, but Daiho just kept walking toward their quarters while thinking that sometimes the right thing to do was also the most dangerous thing to do. That night, while the alien champions prepared for battle with advanced training equipment and genetic enhancement procedures and technological upgrades, Daiho sat in his small room and wrote a message to his daughter telling her that he loved her, and that whatever happened in the tournament, she should remember that. Humans never gave up even when everything seemed hopeless. He did not sleep much because tomorrow he would step into an arena designed for superhuman warriors and face opponents who could kill him with their bare hands, or the arena was unlike anything Daiho had ever seen, and as he stood at the entrance waiting for his first match to begin, he watched the crystal walls shimmer and change shape like they were alive and responding to some invisible command, and within seconds the circular fighting space had transformed into something that looked like a destroyed city with broken buildings and rubble-filled streets and twisted metal sticking up from concrete that had been blasted apart by weapons too powerful. To imagine Graktor, the Korthak champion, stood on the opposite side of the arena, and even from a distance, Daeho could see that the alien warrior was everything the reports had said, and more because he was 3 meters tall with natural armor, plating that covered his body like overlapping shields and muscles that moved under his skin like steel cables and claws that could tear through metal, and a face that showed no emotion except the desire to kill. The alien audience filled the crystal. Seats around the arena and their voices created a sound like distant thunder as they discussed the upcoming match, and most of them seemed to think it would be over very quickly because humans had no natural weapons and no enhanced abilities and no technology that could match what the Korthak possessed, and betting displays showed odds of 1,000 to 1 against the humans surviving more than 5 minutes. Hai-Jin and Wu-Jin sat in the human section, which was very small compared to the areas reserved for the other species, and Hai-Jin was using her communication equipment to record everything for Earth, while trying not to show how worried she was, and Wu-Jin was analyzing the arena layout and trying to find some tactical advantage. That might help Daeho survive, but the options looked very limited. High Marshal Vel Tharian stood in the center of the arena, and his crystal body reflected the lights in patterns that hurt to look at directly, and his voice carried across the space, like breaking glass when he announced the rules, which were simple enough that even humans could understand them. And the first rule was that the match continued until one fighter could not continue, and the second rule was that the arena environment could be used as a weapon but could not be permanently damaged. When the signal to begin echoed through the crystal space, Graktor let out a roar that shook the artificial buildings around them and charged straight toward Daeho with the confidence of a warrior who had never lost a fight, and who expected this one to be easier than most because humans were known to be weak and slow and without any natural defenses. But Daeho did not try to meet the charge head-on, because that would have been suicide. And instead he ran toward the nearest building and slipped through a gap in the wall just as Graktor's claws raked the space where he had been standing, and left deep gouges in the crystal that looked like arena walls, but felt like real concrete under his hands. The Korthak warrior smashed through the wall like it was made of paper and kept coming with determination that never seemed to decrease, and Daeho realized that this opponent would never get tired and never give up and never stop hunting him until one of them was dead. But he also noticed that Graktor moved in straight lines and attacked with overwhelming force, rather than thinking about tactics or using the environment to his advantage. Daeho led the alien warrior deeper into the ruined city and used every piece of cover he could find while staying just ahead of those terrible claws that could cut him in half with a single swipe, and he began to understand the layout of the arena and how the buildings connected to each other and where the weak points might be in the structures that seemed so real but were actually just advanced technology, creating an illusion of a destroyed urban battlefield. The first hour of the fight was just running and hiding and dodging, while Graktor destroyed everything in his path, trying to reach the human who kept slipping away like smoke, and the alien audience began to grow restless because they had expected to see a quick execution, and instead, they were watching something that looked more like a chase scene from a bad entertainment program. But Daeho was learning things about his opponent that the Korthak probably did not realize he was revealing. And the most important thing was that Graktor had been trained to fight other warriors who would stand and face him in direct combat, and he had no experience dealing with someone who refused to fight fair and who used the environment as a weapon instead of relying on personal strength. When Graktor cornered him in what looked like an old building lobby, Daeho noticed that the alien warrior always attacked the same way and always expected his opponent to either run or fight back, but never considered that someone might do something completely unexpected, like triggering a controlled collapse of the ceiling by hitting the right support beam at the right angle with a piece of debris. The building came down in a cloud of dust and broken crystal that looked like concrete, and Graktor was buried under tons of material, but his natural armor protected him from serious injury, and he began digging his way out with roars of anger that echoed through the arena. But by the time he emerged, Daeho was already 2 blocks away, setting up his next trap. The second hour was different because now Daeho was not just running away, but actively using the urban environment to slow down and confuse his opponent. And he discovered that the arena's artificial buildings had realistic weaknesses that could be exploited if someone understood basic engineering and structural dynamics, which most alien warriors probably never bothered to learn. He brought down walls to block passages and created rock slides to force Graktor into narrow spaces, where his size became a disadvantage, and used the twisted metal debris to create obstacles that would slow the Korthak down while allowing a smaller, more agile human to slip through easily. The alien audience was no longer restless, but completely silent, because they had never seen anything like this before, and most of them had expected the human to die bravely in direct combat like a proper warrior, but instead he was fighting like some kind of pest that refused to be eliminated and kept. Finding new ways to avoid destruction, Graktor was getting frustrated because nothing in his training had prepared him for this kind of opponent, and every time he thought he had, the human trapped, something unexpected would happen, like a wall collapsing, or a floor giving way, or a piece of debris falling from above, and the human would disappear again, like he had never been there. By the third hour, the Korthak warrior was moving more slowly because even his enhanced physiology could not maintain maximum effort indefinitely, and his attacks were becoming less precise as anger replaced tactical thinking, and he began making mistakes that a more experienced opponent would have exploited immediately. Dae-ho was tired too, because running and climbing and dodging for 3 hours was exhausting even for someone in good physical condition, but he had noticed something important about the arena layout, and he had been leading Graktor toward a specific location where the artificial buildings were arranged in a way that might give him the chance he needed. The area looked like a shopping district that had been hit by artillery, and there were multi-story buildings on both sides of a narrow street with walkways connecting them at the second and third levels, and Dae-ho had realized that if he could get Graktor into the right position, the entire structure could be brought down in a way that would trap the alien warrior without killing him, when Graktor finally cornered him. In the narrow street between the buildings, Dae-ho did something that surprised everyone, including himself, and instead of running away again, he turned and faced the Korthak warrior and began throwing pieces of debris at him, not to cause damage, but to make him angry enough to charge without thinking about the consequences. The charge came exactly as Dae-ho had hoped, and Graktor rushed forward with all his remaining strength, focused on finally catching the human who had been tormenting him for hours. And just as the alien warrior reached the center of the narrow space, Dae-ho triggered his carefully planned trap. He had spent the last hour weakening the support structures of both buildings using debris as improvised tools, and when he hit the final support beam with a piece of twisted metal, the entire area came down in a carefully controlled collapse that buried Graktor under enough material to pin him down without causing fatal injuries. The arena fell completely silent as dust settled, and everyone waited to see what would emerge from the rubble. And when Dae-ho climbed out battered and bleeding but alive, the silence stretched on for long seconds before High Marshal Veltharion announced that the human had won. The match, by incapacitating his opponent Graktor, was eventually dug out of the debris by arena medical teams. And though he was unconscious and badly bruised, his natural armor had protected him from serious harm, and he would recover to fight again. But his reputation as an unbeatable warrior was finished, and the Korthak delegation sat in stunned silence, trying to understand how their champion had been defeated by a creature with no enhanced abilities. Back in the preparation area, Hyejin was treating Dae-ho's cuts and bruises while trying not to let her hands shake because she had just watched him do something impossible. And Wu Jin was already analyzing data about the next opponent while muttering calculations under his breath, and occasionally looking at Dae-ho like he was seeing him for the first time. The other alien delegations were no longer dismissive or amused, but instead were studying recordings of the match. The arena had transformed again, and this time, it looked like the inside of a massive technological facility, with gleaming metal walls and floors that hummed with energy and control panels covered in lights that blinked in complex patterns, and energy barriers that crackled with power, and automated defense systems that tracked movement with mechanical precision, and everything was designed to give maximum advantage to a species that had mastered advanced technology, Telvash the Nexari. Champion stood at the far end of the facility, and his body was covered in what looked like liquid metal that moved and shifted across his skin and formed into different shapes as needed, and his energy shield created a shimmering dome around him that could deflect most known weapons, and the plasma rifle in his hands glowed with enough power to cut through starship armor. Dae-ho walked into the technological maze carrying only basic equipment that looked primitive compared to what his opponent possessed, and the alien audience was much more attentive this time because they had learned not to underestimate the human, but they still expected the match to end quickly because technology always defeated primitive tactics, and the Nexari were acknowledged masters of advanced warfare. The energy systems throughout the facility created a constant background hum, and Daiho could feel the power flowing through conduits hidden in the walls and floor, and he began to study the layout while staying alert for Telvash, who was moving through the maze of corridors with confidence that his superior equipment would make victory inevitable. Hyejin watched from the observation area and used her recording equipment to capture everything, while Wu Jin analyzed the facility's energy patterns and tried to find weaknesses that might help. But the Nexari technology was centuries ahead of anything humans had developed, and most of the systems were incomprehensible to anyone who had not grown up using such advanced equipment. The first attack came without warning as Telvash appeared around a corner and fired his plasma rifle in a burst that would have vaporized a human if it had connected. But Daiho had learned to expect the unexpected, and he dove behind a control panel just as the energy beam scorched the air where he had been standing. The plasma blast hit an energy conduit and caused a small explosion that sent sparks flying and created a brief power fluctuation. That made some of the lights dim for a few seconds, and Daiho filed that information away for later use, while he looked for a way to escape from his current position before Telvash could line up another shot. The Nexari champion was methodical in his approach and used his energy shield to protect himself while advancing through the facility, and his liquid metal armor adapted to provide additional protection against specific threats, and his tactical computer analyzed the environment and calculated optimal firing solutions with mechanical precision. But Daiho was not fighting like a conventional opponent, and instead of trying to match Telvash's firepower, he was studying the facility itself and learning how the energy systems worked, and where the control circuits were located, and which components were vulnerable to overload if the right kind of feedback was introduced into the network. The second attack came when Telvash cornered him in what looked like a control room, filled with monitoring equipment, and the plasma rifle fired again. But this time, Daiho had positioned himself near a power distribution node, and when he rolled away from the blast, the energy beam hit the node and caused a cascade failure that knocked out several systems throughout that section of the facility. Telvash was surprised by the power failure, because his armor's systems had to compensate for the sudden change in the facility's energy grid, and in that moment of distraction, Daiho managed to escape through a maintenance hatch that had been hidden behind the now darkened control panels. The chase continued through corridors and rooms filled with technology that neither fighter fully understood, but Telvash had the advantage of equipment designed to interface with such systems, while Daiho had to rely on basic engineering principles and his growing understanding of how energy flowed through the facility's networks. After an hour of cat-and-mouse games, Daiho began to recognize patterns in the way the facility operated, and he realized that the energy systems all followed predictable cycles, and that the automated defenses were programmed to avoid damaging critical components, and that the power grid had built-in safety protocols that could be triggered if someone knew where to apply pressure. Telvash was becoming frustrated because his technological advantages were not producing the quick victory he had expected, and the human kept finding ways to use the facility's own systems to create problems and distractions and escape routes that should not have existed according to standard tactical doctrine. The turning point came when Daiho discovered a maintenance area that contained manual override controls for the facility's primary systems, and he realized that these were legacy protocols from whoever had originally built the arena technology thousands of years ago, and they operated on principles that were simpler than the advanced interfaces that modern species used. While Telvash relied entirely on his armor's computer systems to interact with the facility, Daiho began manually rewiring control circuits using techniques he had learned during his military engineering training, and he found that the ancient manual controls could override the modern automated systems if someone was willing to crawl through maintenance tunnels and work with primitive tools. The first manual override shut down the energy barriers in an entire section of the facility and created new pathways that Telvash's tactical computer had not anticipated, and when the Nexari champion tried to follow his armor's navigation system, he found himself trapped in a dead-end corridor while Daiho escaped through a route that should not have existed. The second override redirected power from the automated defense systems to the lighting grid and caused a massive overload that filled several rooms with blinding flashes of light that overwhelmed Tel-Vash's optical sensors and forced him to rely on backup systems that were not as sophisticated as his primary equipment. By the third hour of the match, Dae-ho had gained access to the facility's main power distribution center, and he had learned enough about the energy systems to begin using them as weapons against his opponent. And when Tel-Vash entered the central chamber expecting to corner the human, he found instead that the entire room had become a trap. Dae-ho had rigged the power grid to create electromagnetic pulse bursts that would disrupt electronic equipment without causing permanent damage. And when Tel-Vash stepped into the chamber, the first pulse knocked out his energy shield and caused his liquid metal armor to freeze, in place temporarily while his systems rebooted. The second pulse came before Tel-Vash could fully recover, and it overloaded his plasma rifle and caused it to shut down for safety reasons, and the third pulse disrupted his armor's mobility systems, and left him standing in the center of the room like a statue while his equipment struggled to compensate for the electromagnetic interference. But the electromagnetic pulses affected Dae-ho too, because humans were not immune to electrical fields, and the energy discharges caused burns on his skin and made his muscles cramp and his heart beat irregularly. And by the time he triggered the final pulse that disabled Tel-Vash's remaining systems, he was barely conscious himself. The arena medical teams had to carry both fighters out of the facility, and Tel-Vash was unconscious from system overload, while Dae-ho was suffering from electrical burns and exhaustion. But he was awake enough to hear High Marshal Veltharion announce that the human had won by incapacitating his opponent through tactical use of the arena environment. In the medical bay, Hye-jin sat beside Dae-ho's treatment bed and told him that the alien delegations had been studying human military history between matches, and that they had discovered something that worried them, because humans had a pattern of defeating technologically superior enemies through tactics that seemed impossible until they worked. Wu Jin reported that the other species were no longer just surprised by human victories, but were actively concerned because they were beginning to understand that humans specialized in asymmetric warfare and that they had developed this specialty through thousands of years of fighting each other, under conditions where technological parity was rare and inferior equipment was normal. The Nexari delegation requested copies of all available human military records, and when they were told that such information was classified, they offered to trade advanced technology for basic tactical manuals, and the fact that they were willing to make such trades indicated how seriously they were taking the human threat. Veltharion visited the medical bay and asked Dae-ho how he had known that the facility's ancient manual controls could override modern automated systems, and Dae-ho explained that humans learned to work with whatever technology was available, and that sometimes older systems were more reliable than newer ones. That night, while Dae-ho recovered from his electrical injuries, the alien military academies throughout the galaxy began downloading and analyzing every piece of human military history they could access, and their tactical computers were trying to find patterns in human warfare that might explain how a species with no apparent advantages kept winning battles they should lose. The arena had become something beautiful and terrible at the same time, with walls made of pure crystal that seemed to sing when the light touched them, and the entire space resonated with psychic energy that made the air itself feel thick and alive, and every surface reflected and amplified mental power, until even humans who had no psychic abilities could feel the pressure building inside their skulls, like the beginning of a storm. Psythane, the Morden champion, floated in the center of the crystalline space without any visible means of support, and his almost human appearance was made disturbing by eyes that were completely black and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and around him small objects lifted and moved through the air without being touched, while the crystal walls pulsed with energy that responded to his thoughts. Dae-ho entered the arena carrying the same basic equipment he had used in previous matches, and immediately felt the psychic pressure, trying to push into his mind like invisible hands searching for something to grab onto, and he had to fight the urge to retreat, because every instinct told him he was walking into a battle he could not possibly win. The alien audience was completely silent, because they understood what they were about to witness, and psychic combat was considered the most advanced form of warfare because it required not just physical skill, but mental discipline that took decades to develop, and most species could produce only a few individuals capable of such abilities. Hai Jin and Wu Jin watched from the observation area, and both of them looked worried because they had studied the Mordun capabilities and knew that Sithane could crush a starship, hull with focused thought, and could control minds across vast distances, and could manipulate matter at the molecular level through pure mental force. The match began without any visible signal, and suddenly, Daeho felt something trying to force its way into his consciousness like a cold wind blowing through his thoughts, and he realized that Sithane was attempting to take control of his mind and turn him into a puppet who would follow psychic commands without resistance. But something unexpected happened because human minds were apparently different from what Sithane had encountered before, and instead of finding organized thoughts that could be easily manipulated, the Mordun champion discovered a chaotic jumble of memories and calculations and random observations that shifted and changed faster than psychic influence could track them. Daeho was thinking about tactical assessments and memories of his daughter so young and fragments of old songs and combat calculations, and worry about He-Jin, and wonder about what the crystal walls were made of, and irritation at the psychic pressure and determination to survive, and dozens of other thoughts, all at the same time in a pattern that seemed to have no logical structure. Sithane's first attempt at mind control failed because he could not find a stable foundation to build upon. And every time he tried to establish psychic dominance over one thought pattern, Daeho's mind would jump to something completely different, and the mental chaos made precise control impossible. The Mordun champion tried a different approach and began using telekinetic force to attack physically rather than mentally, and Daeho found himself dodging invisible hands that could crush stone and being pushed around by forces he could not see but could definitely feel as they slammed him into crystal walls and lifted him off the ground. But while Sithane was concentrating on telekinetic attacks, Daeho was studying the crystal arena and noticing how the walls responded to psychic energy and how the resonance patterns changed when mental force was applied, and he began to understand that the crystalline structure was designed to focus and amplify psychic power rather than just contain it. The first insight came when Daeho realized that the crystal formations were not random, but followed specific geometric patterns that created natural focal points and reflection angles, and that psychic energy bounced off certain surfaces in predictable ways, just like light or sound or any other form of energy. Sithane was using the arena's amplification effects to increase his power, but he was doing so instinctively without understanding the underlying principles. And Daeho began to see ways that the same crystal structures could be used to redirect psychic force or create interference patterns that might disrupt mental attacks. The battle continued with Sithane using increasingly powerful telekinetic assaults, while Daeho dodged and ran and tried to survive long enough to implement his growing understanding of how the arena worked, and several times he was nearly crushed by invisible forces that picked up pieces of crystal and hurled them with enough speed to shatter steel. But each attack taught him more about how psychic energy flowed through the crystalline environment, and he began to position himself at specific locations where the resonance patterns would interfere with Sithane's mental focus and make precise telekinetic control more difficult. The turning point came when Daeho deliberately injured himself by running into a sharp crystal formation, and the sudden spike of pain and determination created an emotional surge that was so distinctly human in its self-destructive intensity that it completely disrupted Sithane's mental equilibrium. The Mordun champion had never encountered a mind that would deliberately cause itself harm for tactical advantage, and the alien logic that governed psychic combat had no framework for understanding such behavior, and for a critical moment, Sithane's concentration was broken by confusion and surprise. In that instant of psychic disruption, Daeho struck with a piece of crystal that he had been carrying, and the physical attack succeeded, because Sithane had been relying entirely on mental defenses and had not expected a purely mechanical assault during a psychic battle, and the impact sent the Mordun champion crashing into the arena wall. The crystal amplified the shock of impact and created feedback loops in the psychic field that stunned Sithane temporarily, and while the alien champion struggled to regain his mental balance, Daeho continued the physical assault with desperate efficiency, because he knew this might be his only chance. The fight became a strange combination of mental and physical combat with Scythane, trying to recover his psychic dominance while defending against conventional attacks and Daiho using his understanding of the crystal arena to create interference patterns that made telekinetic control difficult and unpredictable. The final moment came when Daiho managed to position Scythane at a specific location where multiple crystal formations created a natural psychic dampening field, and then triggered a resonance cascade by striking the right crystal at the right angle with enough force to overload the mental amplification system. The psychic feedback knocked Scythane unconscious, and the sudden silence in the arena was deafening after hours of mental pressure and crystalline resonance, and when the medical teams arrived, they found the Morden champion uninjured but completely catatonic, while Daiho was bleeding from multiple cuts and barely able to stand. High Marshal Veltharion announced the human victory with what might have been respect in his crystal voice, and the alien audience sat in stunned silence because they had just witnessed something that challenged their understanding of how psychic combat worked and how mental superiority could be defeated by physical tactics. In the medical bay, Daiho received treatment for his injuries, while He-Jin and Wu-Jin tried to process what they had seen, and Wu-Jin admitted that he had not understood most of what happened during the match because psychic warfare was completely outside human experience. But other aliens throughout the galaxy were understanding all too well, and emergency meetings were being held in capital cities across 17 different species because the human victories were revealing something that worried the established powers more than they had initially realized. The pattern of human success was becoming clear, and it was not just about tactical innovation or technological adaptation, but about a fundamental difference in how humans approached problems and the willingness to accept costs and risks that other species considered unacceptable. Military analysts were discovering that human warfare was based on principles that violated standard galactic doctrine, and that humans regularly made strategic decisions that seemed to prioritize victory over survival, and that they had developed this approach through millennia of fighting under conditions where conventional tactics meant certain defeat. The reports reaching alien governments described a species that specialized in turning disadvantage into advantage, and that seemed to treat impossible odds as normal operating conditions, and that had apparently built their entire military philosophy around the assumption that they would always be outmatched by their opponents. Some alien leaders were beginning to understand that allowing humans into the Galactic Council might have been a serious miscalculation, because a species that could defeat superior opponents through unconventional tactics might not remain content with junior status in galactic politics. The betting odds for the final match were now showing the human as a slight favorite, because the alien spectators had learned that conventional wisdom did not apply when humans were involved, and that predicting the outcome of human combat required understanding principles that most galactic military academies did not teach. The arena had become something beyond imagination, and as Daiho stepped into the final battleground, he saw that it combined elements from all the previous environments into a shifting nightmare that changed constantly under the control of his opponent, and urban ruins mixed with technological corridors, mixed with crystalline formations that pulsed with psychic energy, while automated systems tracked his movements and energy barriers flickered in and out of existence according to patterns only Morgeth Drakul could understand. The Ascended Champion stood in the center of the chaos, and he was exactly what 300 years of victory had created, because his body combined the best genetic traits from multiple species enhanced, with technology that was centuries ahead of anything else in the galaxy, and psychic abilities that rivaled the greatest Mordun masters, and he moved with the fluid grace of perfect evolution, while the arena responded to his will like an extension. Of his own body, Daiho carried the same basic equipment he had used throughout the tournament, and he knew that he could not match Morgeth in any single category of ability, because the Ascended was stronger and faster and smarter and more technologically advanced and psychically powerful and genetically superior in every measurable way. The alien audience filled every available seat and viewing area because word of the humans' previous victories had spread throughout the galaxy, and representatives from dozens of species had arrived to witness what everyone expected to be either the greatest upset in tournament history or the final proof that genetic and technological superiority would always triumph over primitive tactics. He-Jin and Wu-Jin sat in the human section, and both of them looked amazed that they had made it this far, but also terrified of what was about to happen because they had studied Morgeth's combat records and knew that he had never been seriously challenged in 3 centuries of fighting, and that he represented the absolute pinnacle of what galactic civilization could produce. High Marshal Veltharion announced the beginning of the final match with what might have been anticipation in his crystal voice, because even he was curious to see whether human adaptability could overcome absolute superiority. And when the signal echoed through the arena, the environment immediately began shifting under Morgeth's mental control. The first attack came from 3 directions simultaneously as the Ascended used telekinetic force to hurl debris while energy weapons fired from automated systems, and the arena floor itself shifted to create pitfalls and obstacles, and Dayho barely managed to avoid destruction by diving behind cover that disappeared moments later as Morgeth reshaped the environment. For the first hour of the battle, Dayho was completely on the defensive because Morgeth was using every advantage at his disposal, and the arena became a constantly changing maze of death where survival required split-second decisions and perfect timing, and there was no opportunity to implement any kind of tactical plan. But as the fight continued, Dayho began to notice something important about his opponent. And despite all of Morgeth's enhancements and abilities and technological advantages, he fought with perfect technique according to established galactic combat doctrine, and every decision he made was tactically optimal according to military principles that had been refined over thousands of years. Morgeth was like a flawless algorithm that calculated the best possible response to every situation and then executed that response with mechanical precision, and his 300 years of victory had reinforced this approach because perfect technique had never failed him against any opponent he had ever faced. But Dayho had learned something different during his years of military service on Earth, and he had been trained to fight against superior opponents by making decisions that seemed tactically unsound but created unexpected opportunities, and he began to realize that Morgeth's perfection might also be his weakness. The turning point came when Dayho deliberately sacrificed a tactically advantageous position to gain psychological leverage by making a choice that appeared to be a mistake but actually created cascading effects that Morgeth's enhanced intelligence could not predict, because the decision violated basic military doctrine. Morgeth responded to the apparently foolish human tactic with textbook precision and moved to exploit the advantage he had been given, but the exploitation led him into a position that Dayho had actually intended. And suddenly, the Ascended found himself facing consequences he had not calculated. The pattern repeated as Dayho continued making decisions that seemed suboptimal but created unpredictable chain reactions, and Morgeth's perfect tactical computer brain began to struggle with responses to behavior that did not follow logical patterns, and his centuries of training in optimal warfare became a liability when facing completely irrational human choices. The battle shifted from a contest of abilities to a psychological puzzle as Morgeth tried to understand why the human kept making apparently self-destructive decisions that somehow produced strategic advantages, and his enhanced intelligence became overwhelmed by the task of calculating responses to tactics that violated every principle of efficient combat. Dayho realized that his opponent could not understand imperfect solutions because perfection had been bred and trained and enhanced into every aspect of Morgeth's existence, and the concept of deliberately accepting damage or loss as an acceptable cost for victory was completely alien to someone who had been designed to minimize all risks and maximize all advantages. The climactic moment came when Dayho made the most tactically questionable decision of the entire tournament, and instead of trying to avoid Morgeth's ultimate attack, he charged directly into it while carrying an improvised explosive device made from arena components that would destroy them both if it detonated. At close range, Morgeth's enhanced reflexes and tactical computer and genetic superiority all told him to avoid the mutual destruction scenario because there had to be a better solution, and his perfect mind spent critical milliseconds searching for the optimal response to such an irrational attack. But Dayho was not looking for an optimal solution, and he was willing to accept death as the price of victory, and his desperate gambit succeeded not because it was tactically sound, but because it was so completely contrary to rational combat doctrine that Morgeth could not process it quickly enough to counter. The explosion filled the arena with smoke and debris, and when it cleared, both fighters were down, but Daeho was still breathing, while Morgeth lay unconscious from the shock of an attack that his perfect mind had been unable to comprehend or prevent. High Marshal Veltharion stood in the center of the destroyed arena, and his crystal voice carried across the silent space, as he announced that for the first time in 3,000 years of tournament history, a species with no apparent advantages had won the championship through pure tactical adaptability and willingness to accept impossible odds. The alien audience sat in stunned silence because they had just witnessed something that challenged everything they believed about combat and genetic superiority and technological advancement and the natural order of galactic civilization. And some of them were already calculating what this meant for the balance of power throughout known space. In the medical bay, Daeho received treatment for injuries that would have killed most beings, but somehow he had survived his own desperate attack. And when reporters from across the galaxy tried to interview him, he simply said that he had done what anyone would do when someone had to step up. But the galaxy now knew that humans possessed something that no amount of technology or genetic enhancement or psychic power could replicate, and that was the ability to turn disadvantage into victory through determination and creative thinking and the willingness to pay any price for success. The immediate political ramifications were enormous because humanity was granted full voting rights in the Galactic Council and significant resource allocations and representation on military planning committees and access to technologies that had been restricted to senior species. But the deeper impact was psychological, because every major military academy in known space began studying human warfare and trying to understand how a species with inferior capabilities could consistently defeat superior opponents through tactics that violated established doctrine. Haye Jin was promoted to diplomatic attaché and began working on first contact protocols that treated humans as a major galactic power rather than primitive newcomers, and Wu Jin established military exchange programs where alien officers studied human tactical thinking while humans learned alien technologies. Back on Earth, so young. Kim watched her father's final match on the news, and when reporters asked how it felt to have a famous father, she smiled and said that he had always been like this, and that he never gave up even when he probably should. Daeho himself returned to Earth quietly and declined most interviews, and when pressed about how he had changed galactic politics forever, he simply said that sometimes the right thing to do was also the most dangerous thing to do. But across the galaxy, every species now understood that humans were different and that they specialized in winning fights. They should not be able to win, and that they treated impossible odds as normal operating conditions, and that they had built their entire civilization around the principle that there was always a way to victory if someone was willing to pay the price.